as we did yesterday with our curators talk with Jasmine Allen and Sarah Victoria Turner, we're going to do a second curators talk with Jennifer Slivka. And I'm going to just do a little brief bio first, and then we're going to have a conversation, but she's also going to show what this exhibition was that she was involved in or that she curated. And but I will start by introducing you to her. Jennifer is the keeper of Western art at the Ashmolean Museum and professorial fellow at Balliol College at the University of Oxford. She's a specialist in Italian Renaissance and Baroque art with a particular interest in transhistorical and interdisciplinary projects. And she has curated a number of exhibitions which range from thematic, monographic, and transhistorical approaches, including, just a list here, Devotion by Design, Italian Altarpieces Before 1500, which was at the National Gallery in 2011. Visions of Paradise, Botticini's Palmieri altarpiece, which was at the National Gallery 2015 to 16. Monochrome Painting in Black and White, which was at the National Gallery and the Kunstpalast Düsseldorf from 2017 to 18, and the exhibition that brought her here today, which is reframed The Woman at the Window, which was at Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2022. Before joining the Ashmolean and the University of Oxford, she worked as a curator at the National Gallery, where she designed and taught a collaborative MA with King's College London. And this will be kind of a nice counterpoint to what we had yesterday, where, of course, Jasmine is the director of a museum about windows that is permanent. And as she said, a third of the collection has just recently been rehung or whatever you do with installed. That is the word people use in museums. Versus a temporary exhibition, and then also one that is focused on the window as an object, and one that is a representation of windows, one that is focusing on the window itself and the images within that window, and one that is focusing on the figure at the window. And so she's going to give an overview, because for those of you who are not able to see the exhibition, and we do have the catalog open in the drawing room display at the Paul Mellon Center, but obviously that's just one page. You can't see the rest of it. So she's going to give us a bit of an overview so that we can kind of sort of experience what it was like.
And I might do a kind of swivel so I can see what I'm talking about. First of all, is that okay for the sound? Okay. Yes. Okay, good. Yeah. In the back, just let me know. Thank you. I'm also slightly shivery, so sorry about that. First of all, I wanted to say what a pleasure and a privilege it is to be here with you all. Thank you very much for the kind invitation. It's been a pleasure actually revisiting this exhibition in anticipation of speaking to you all today. And I was really excited to be here today. I'm sorry to have missed yesterday, but I saw the lineup. And in many ways, this is kind of a dream audience. I wish we could all transport back in time and I could take you through this exhibition, because the conversations that we would have, I hope we are able to kind of replicate some of that experience and have these discussions today. I'm really excited. And just hearing you and seeing the list of talks from yesterday, I can see that essentially this exhibition picks up some of the threads that I'm sure, or the seeds that you planted yesterday, and sort of weaves them all together. I would say not as in-depth as your great scholarship, but of course this is a very different kind of format and venue in an exhibition form. So as you heard, I am an Italian Renaissance and Baroque specialist, but in the last 10 years I've been working on transhistorical projects, largely exhibitions, but not only. I like to work with contemporary artists as well. And I really love the way transhistorical projects, so crossing geographic and chronological boundaries, can make connections, of course, between the past and present, but also concentrate on those important moments of adoption and adaptation or diversion. And as you heard also, when I was working on monochrome in both that exhibition and this exhibition, I took a motif or a technique and I identified it, in history, and I tried to trace it from where I could find its early origins all the way through. So for example, in monochrome, it was a history of 700 years of painting in black and white in the West. And then I got slightly more ambitious with Woman in the Window, and I traced 3,000 years in the history of art. And I wanted to get out of just my kind of strictly Western perspective, although I am the head of a Western art department, I admit, and think about windows more broadly, geographically as well. So that was my particular interest. And the reason it was at Dulwich Picture Gallery, some of you will know this picture. So I was at Dulwich and I had my little encounter with the picture they call their Mona Lisa, which is their Rembrandt little girl at a window. And I was just really struck by the way I was pulled across the room to look at this painting. And already, I don't know how you feel when you enter collections around the world, but the wall power, as curators say, but the ability of an artwork that was made hundreds of years ago to still pull us across the room. And I started asking myself, why does this picture do that? Yes, Rembrandt, he is a master, he is a skillful painter. But for me, it's not because it's Rembrandt. For me, it's the composition. And I think some of us in this room might agree with that. And I went back after my visit to Dulwich and I started reading the Rembrandt literature. I'm not a specialist in that period, but I was struck. I mean, there's so much literature on Rembrandt. I was struck by, in all the literature that I read, the master, the great master, was credited with either inventing or innovating this motif over and over again. And with my Italian Renaissance hat on, I disagreed. This productive disagreement that we have with the scholars of the present and the past always produces something new. And I was also very struck by the way, in the centuries of literature on this picture, the interpretation of the figure in the picture of the subject had changed. And there seemed to me to be a lot of projection onto this female figure. Her age changes. You know, is she a maidservant? Is she a sex worker? Is she a Jewish bride? I mean, there were 12 or 13 different interpretations. And I thought, it's so interesting. We all do this kind of presentism where we project whatever we're interested in or thinking about on that day onto these kind of images. And I thought, I think we do that quite a bit onto female bodies, in my opinion, and certainly in works like this, because I started collecting images, you know, virtually, images of women at windows. And I was struck by how much, and this room will know about this perhaps more than me, we see a woman at a window. You do, of course, get men at the window. We could probably give you their name and their age and their date and tell you what kingdom they ruled and what lands they owned. So many women at the window are nameless. They are not portraits, they are types. They're the black woman, the old woman, the young woman, the blue woman, that, you know. And so I thought these nameless women that we just keep projecting things onto. So those are my initial kind of research questions. And as I was gathering my kind of images of women at windows, just as a kind of intellectual exercise at first, I started thinking about the window itself and thinking about architecture. And of course, then testing myself with my Western brain of assuming that a window is a window with a view, with a pane of glass. But of course, some of the images of women at windows that I was collecting were windows that were glassless. They were wind eyes, as they were historically. They were apertures that let the smoke out. And then I started thinking about windows, you know, in Renaissance Italy that we just heard about that didn't have glass. It would have an oiled piece of paper or textile. And then kind of going forward and thinking about, well, what do windows in the East look like in Indo-Arabic cultures? And I think there was some discussion of that, you know, jali windows, jali screens, shoji screens in Japan, that sort of thing. And what are those differences? So these are the kind of things that I wanted to explore over time. Where do we find women at windows? In what cultures? What did they mean in those cultures? Why were they being reproduced over and over again? Are there connections? And where do we diverge? A huge set of questions. And of course, this ended up turning into an exhibition because I ran into the director of Dulwich Picture Gallery. I will admit, after a few glasses of champagne, at a Tate gallery opening. And I said, I think I have an exhibition idea for you. And the next day I had an appointment in my diary made by her secretary saying, when are you going to come and pitch this idea? I hadn't even told her. So it was something that came together just out of curiosity. And I think these are the kinds of questions we ask when we look at anything around the world. So I'll just take you on your whistle-stop tour of the show. These were essentially where I went with my section titles. I won't go into them, but I think so many of you have discussed aspects of some of these subjects in your talks in the last 2 days. I'll just say a little bit more about the earliest examples I found, because for me, those are the most distant from what I'm used to studying. And this ivory is just one example, but essentially the earliest works I was able to identify all were associated with cults in a temple to a female goddess. And the goddess was usually a fertility goddess or a goddess of love. So in Cyprus, it was Aphrodite, but elsewhere it might be Ishtar, or, you know, in the kind of Babylonian traditions and things like that. So a powerful female woman who in the Eastern tradition is not represented in profile, as we typically have in early works in the West, but frontally. And there's a quite distinctive architecture around her. She is in the temple. And so I started reading the literature around these objects and consulting the specialists because I knew I was very much out of my depth. And extraordinarily, to this day, the literature describes these as either the goddess or priestesses of the goddess at the temple. And she is a sacred prostitute, is the term that's always used in quotes. And as some of you will know, there are two ancient sources, at least, textual sources, who describe this practice in the temple. But to this day, we don't know if we rely on those sources, whether sacred prostitution was actually practiced or not. But these are the images from about 3000 BC. I started 1000 BC, roughly, right through the present. The idea of a woman in a window in a piece of architecture is associated with sex work, which I just thought was absolutely fascinating, something I didn't expect to find. And that led me to thinking about the construction, that convenient construction for artists of using a window as a frame, essentially. It's a kind of easy but sophisticated way of presenting a female to the beholder. And I thought, isn't that interesting? It automatically creates a relationship between the beholder and the subject. And it frames, or let's say positions you in a certain relationship. So you, in many cases, you are in a kind of implicated narrative or an implicated relationship with the figure. And then you might start thinking about, well, is it passive? Is this person looking at me? Or in the case of the Rembrandt, or in the case of these early instances where the woman is looking out, is there a reciprocity of the gaze? Is this person aware of me? And I thought, isn't that a neat way of artists framing a woman? And then you have to think about what that window frame is doing. Is it enclosing her? Is it idealizing her? Is it trapping her? And so I started kind of riffing on those sorts of motifs. And I realized very soon that in order to understand the objects I was looking at, I had to understand much more about the history of the window, how it was used, and then the social history as well. I wanted to know whether the objects I was looking at, should I understand them as actually representing contemporary behavior in a different society or custom or culture, or were they doing something else? Were they doing something more subversive? Were they fantasies? So these are the kinds of questions that got me going. I won't give you all the answers. You will know some of the answers yourself, but just to give you some examples here. This is, of course, where my Renaissance brain went immediately. And I was thinking about Botticelli and other 15th century painters in which you see these aristocratic women in windows in ways that you never would in Renaissance Florence. If you're of a certain social economic level, you would never be seen in this way. So these were often works that were commissioned, of course, by husbands or husbands-to-be for the bride. And there's a kind of sanctioned looking here, and there's always the parapet and that sort of thing. In my personal opinion, but I'm happy to debate this, there is some reference here to Dante and to his description of falling in love with a beautiful woman at the window. And of course, as you can see, the other Dante is riffing directly on that, and he's citing the actual Dante poem of La Donna della Finestra in the Vita Nuova. I was thinking about, well, I have to do a nod to Rembrandt because, of course, he did do extraordinary things with the motif. And of course, he taught a whole subsequent generation or generations who took up the motif and took it in whole new directions. And I'm here thinking about these kinds of artists who show women at windows, often selling their wares. I'll just draw your attention to the motif that you almost always see in Dutch 17th century of the bird and the bird cage, the woman in the window and the bird in the bird cage, which you may or may not be able to see here. I mean, I hardly need to spell it out for you, but she is the bird in the birdcage, and the specialists among you will know that there's lots of sexual innuendo and poetry and funny stories of the period in which, depending off the bird has flown the cage or if the door of the birdcage is open, these are all allusions to the woman's sexuality. And then there's amazing Cameroonian artist who just flips it all on its head and has a very powerful, powerful woman at the window with the bird in the birdcage. I was really interested in, especially in the literature in Christianity, women at windows is a sort of frowned upon thing. You think about Augustine and Jerome talking about the lust of the eyes and lowering the eyelids and things like that. And yet you have the Virgin at the window. And in fact, one of her names is the Finestra Coeli. She is the way to heaven. She is the window to heaven. And I started thinking about this amazing sculpture of incarcerated saint who survived at the window because she was eating the Eucharist fed to her by angels. As I said, I also wanted to think about screens as windows and what happens in, particularly in Indian narratives of the whisperings and the kind of extraordinary tales of what happens at the Jali screen. And the idea that Jali screens historically, initially, were often associated with the realm of the women. They could see out, but remained unseen themselves. And I thought that was a very interesting reversal. And some of you will know this picture. I thought it was very interesting in a kind of biblical narrative. A window imagined from way back then was a Jali screen. And that was a kind of fortuitous curatorial moment that I wanted to share with you. Then I started thinking about when we start knowing the names of the models, that they are participants in the way that we have in the scholarship now. There's a discussion about models in, particularly in paintings, as being co-creators. And I started wondering, well, when did we start knowing the names of these nameless women? And really that seemed to coincide with the professionalism of models. And I was interested in Tillmans for many reasons, but he has always called the people in his windows his accomplices. I thought that was really powerful. I had to include a Genskin, and I did this. If you're familiar with the architecture at Dulwich, it is very distinctive, and it contains a mausoleum at the very heart of the building with the two founders. Their busts are there. Well, they are physically there, their remains, and their two busts are there. The wife of one of them, who paid for most of the museum, is off to the side and invisible. I wanted people to come here and see, ask, where is the woman? And I was like, exactly. I also wanted to draw the attention to, they'd seen maybe 40 artworks by this point, not one of them probably made by a female artist. So I thought just that idea of all of these women at windows being portrayed for thousands of years, men portraying women for other men in most cases. And that was a kind of shock to some of the more traditional visitors to Dulwich who came up to me afterwards and said, I'd never even thought about that. I find Genskin very poetic. She works largely with windows. And of course, this sculpture becomes a window when you walk in front of it and you become the woman in the window. But you might interpret the artist herself as a woman in the window here. I hardly need to say much about the final room, but I just called the final room the artist at the window, but it did happen to be all female artists. And I was thinking about the way Cindy Sherman uses her own body in all of her works. And she's thinking particularly about the stereotypes of women in the media, the sex pot, the ingénue, the saint. Do I have also Louise Bourgeois, who uses her own window. And when she wasn't leaving her flat in New York for many years, she dug this out of her basement and created her own window, My Blue Window. And that was sort of her outside, her line to the outside world, as she described it, her connection. And I wanted to end with these photographs by Abramovich in which she becomes the woman in the window. So her performance in this case is well, as you can see, it's a role exchange. So she goes to the red light district in Amsterdam and takes the place of the sex worker and sends the sex worker to her opening at the Apple Gallery to preside over the opening. She deliberately chose this particular space in the gallery that had a broad window, and she describes part of the performance that's her label there, that's Marina's label, is what it felt like to be the woman in the window and what it did to her ego. And she said, my ego was ground down to zero. And this is obviously just celebrating me. No, but what I wanted to say is that this is actually to remind me that it's very, very challenging to do trans-historical shows and thematic shows to secure the loans, because people say, oh, we'll ask for something else. But I think there's great merit in it, and largely because I think these shows slice through the history of art in a different and very interesting way. They draw connections, as I said, between different cultures and different times. But I love the more sociological and anthropological inflections that you have, that everyone can come to this show, find something they love or that speaks to them, that speaks to their own lived experience. There's any number of potential interpretations that are kind of valid here. And I think this is the kind of route that exhibition making is going. So that's why I said there was a very positively reviewed, and I was really thrilled because I didn't expect it at all. So that's our run through. But these are here so I can kind of flip back if you have any questions or you want to comment or add anything.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, so before we open it up to the floor, because I know that we want to do that pretty soon, I suppose it was just, I had a series of questions that kind of emerged when I was just thinking through what I wanted to know from you. And well, you know, and I'll just say all of them together just because, you know, you can just kind of express your response to all that. But the first thing was, were there objects that you wanted to include at the time that you weren't able to include? Looking back, oh wait, I figured. But then my second question was, looking back now to when you did it then, are there things you might have done differently or things you would have included given hindsight? And the other is, if you were to do that same exhibition now, not having done it then, what would be different about, I mean, in the intervening years, that how you've changed or how the art world has changed or you know, everything. So those were kind of the thoughts that had gone through my head when I thought about this. And I wasn't sure if you wanted to kind of respond to all those, which I know happens with every exhibition, but I think particularly applicable to this, and you know, being a woman and the woman in the window and the power or the powerlessness and the voyeurism and I know that the exhibition catalog very much highlights how COVID really made us aware, and I know I said this as part of organizing this conference, of it really heightened that being on one side of the window and someone else being on the other side of the window, and there's just beautiful images in the catalog that kind of express that too, of you know, a child on one side and the grandparent on the other, or things like that. So those were just kind of the things that spilled out of me when I was thinking of this conversation.
Thank you. Great question. I think in any exhibition you ever do, there's the one that got away or the 20 that got away. I think even more with thematic trans-historical, because you really have to narrow yourself down and focus and think about what is the different kind of threads that you want to pull out. And there are a number of threads here that I didn't mention now, but I'm thinking in particular about film and film noir and The Woman in the Window, Fritz Lang, and all of these things. So those are drawn out a little bit more in the catalogue. You have limited physical space in the exhibition, and particularly in Dulwich, which is not hugely big, but I'm also slightly against very big exhibitions. I find them very overwhelming, and I want to see a little and well and be guided through them. One object that was on my got away list is from the British Museum, and I encourage you all to go have a look at it. It is an ancient Roman grave marker, and as many of you probably know, in these kind of grave markers, the way you represent the deceased is at a window so that they are ever present. And these were largely objects that would be set into constructions which were houses. So, and historically you would go and visit your ancestors and like take a little picnic to the Appia Antica and go have a picnic with your ancestors so they are ever present. And there's an amazing group which are also of freed enslaved people. And it has their kind of freed name, like I was a slave, and you take on the name of your former slave owner often. And there's an amazing one, so that already is an amazing story, that one of the figures has been recarved. So we think it was a man and a woman. Often you get a man and a woman holding hands in a kind of gesture of espousal. And this one has been recarved, so it's two women in this gesture. And I was really fascinated, and there's tons of scholarship on this, particularly in gender studies, of what was the relationship between these two women and the idea that they could be lovers. It was kind of an extraordinary idea. And I thought, gosh, the idea of changing and recasting and the way that we rethink these images, there was so much there that I thought we could do with that object, but obviously borrowing a huge stone ancient Roman slab is not an easy thing. So with that, I think we could have done a lot.
Well, and I just wanted to jump in on the idea of the window and death and all that.
Mm-hmm.
And this just struck me just sitting through the last panel that as a teenager, I went into a charity shop and I got Lauren Bacall's autobiography. And the Christmas after Humphrey Bogart died, her Christmas card that year that she sent out to people was her and I think her children at a window with snow falling outside. And there's something, obviously she's not the dead one, he's the dead one, but there's something about that figure at the window. And I don't know, it just struck me listening to this and then this idea of, death being shown as a figure at a window, or, the deceased being shown as a figure at a window.
Yeah, I thought of a version of that and this grave stele as well, because we were talking about windows as portals. And in that case, if you think about the sacred images, a portal between the celestial world, the other world, and paradise and this world, or in that case also, the other world and this world, I think it would have made that impact. So that was one of the ones that got away. To the point of changing, I mean, every time you do, I would love to do the show all over again and take out a whole new strand. But I started planning the show. It was meant to open before. It was meant to open in 2020. So it was delayed by 2 years. And that's when I thought, actually, I have to rethink quite a bit. And it was still quite raw, I think, for all of us when we opened the exhibition. The museum had hardly been open for very long. And there was something like 600 people at the opening. We were all just so thrilled. It was really quite moving. And what I didn't show is that I included an epilogue at the very end of the exhibition that I wanted to stand outside of the show. But it was a sort of an important, I think, nod to everything we had just been through. And I borrowed 2 works from the National Portrait Gallery, who had, as you may know, created this really wonderful program in which people from all across the nation sent in their photographs of their experience of lockdown. And a huge percentage of them was about people at the window. And many, many were women at the window. It was called Hold Still. You may have seen it. And I was really moved by that. And so I thought, well, there has to be something here about, you've just looked at all, let's say, these Renaissance and Baroque paintings of people in windows, often looking quite forlorn or trapped in their socioeconomic station. And then we were all sort of trapped, and we knew what it felt like to look at that outside view longingly and not be able to interact. And I was also particularly interested in reading a lot of the literature around, historically, of course, windows functioned as this great sites of exchange, as was discussed here. And, all the accoutrements that would follow that, special stools and special things for leaning and for chatting. And then, of course, that's slightly disappeared when we had computers and iPhones and whatever. And then that completely came back during lockdown, was where you would chat to your neighbors or leave little presents for your friends. And I just thought, we think about windows so much more now, I think, than we did. They sort of fell out of favor and we all became obsessed with them for 2 or 3 years. And I wanted to draw that out.
Yeah. Oh, okay. I am going to open it to the floor because I'm seeing some excited hands. Now they look embarrassed that they're so excited, but they are very excited.
Thanks, Jen. I was just wondering about the man at the window, in as much as
next show.
just thinking about, I'm just thinking about in the National Portrait Gallery, it's Henry VII, which 1505, and he's got
Ruler.
his little sort of plinth parapet, I guess, in front of him, the stone sill. And then thinking in the National with the early Netherlandish and the portraits of both men and women, and they are both at windows, often with the hands. And I just wondered, I'd be really interested to know, what the differences are where we do see men at windows, and what happens as you sort of progress, say, from the 16th century further on, because I'm sort of, then get types in the Netherlands of sort of men with loops at the window, but I'd just love to know what you think about the difference. And it seems to me there's much less of a sexual nature about the man at the window in the 17th century, and obviously not in portraiture, but really what struck you about the differences?
Thank you. Great question. And actually, you slightly highlighted the differences in your question. Thank you. As I sort of alluded to very, very swiftly, is usually when we get a man at the window, we know exactly who he is. And that's true, gosh, I mean, as early as I can think of, sort of pre-Renaissance onwards. And a lot of that, I mean, it depends on the window that this person is at, but often it's a ruler portrait. As many of you will know, that's one way that rulers appear to their audience is at the window, even to today. Kings, popes, what have you, appear at the window. Other ones, slightly later, 18th, 19th century, is gentlemen surveying their lands. And of course, when I was looking into the history of the window and the history of the usage of the window, all of you will know this much better than me, but that idea of the right to a view and different ideas around legal questions around windows, who gets windows, where can windows look onto and not, and that kind of bringing back that really important ancient Roman idea of the window with a view, and the view has to be of your great lands. It shows off your power and your prestige. And so often when we see a man looking out of the window, it's of his palatial abode over his many lands and sheep, and it's about his wealth generally.
Thank you so much. Really fascinating. I'm sad I missed it. But just to respond also to that, I was also thinking your discussion really distilled for me why I have found a portrait of a man at a window so odd for so long, which is Caillebot's portrait of his, we know it's his brother, although it doesn't tell us in the title, but that kind of looking, that anonymous figure looking away, but this idea that, men are not pictured anonymously at windows, and there is this sort of frisson that happens, this almost sexual frisson. And
that one is quite voyeuristic as well.
It is.
Or
yeah.
you feel like you are him. That's the other slight difference.
Yeah, there is an odd projection happening. Yeah. However, that's not my question.
But it is a great painting.
Yeah. So could you tell us a bit more about that extraordinary Renaissance sculpture of the woman behind bars?
If you read one of the reviews, Laura Cumming was just so taken by this. I started taking her around the exhibition. She's like, we just have to stop for a second. She really had a moment with this. I find it very, very moving. I've never seen anything else like it. It was with Sam Fogg. It's now in a private collection. This is a saint that is known, well, her legend is told in many places, and there are different people who claim her, and her name changes slightly. So she could be from Cornwall, or she could be from the south of Italy, or what have you. But the story remains, which is, of course, she's a beautiful young woman who rejects the advances of a barbarian ruler who places her in jail. What we think of this object, I should say that she's life-size, and this was probably immured on the exterior of a church, we think. And I love that idea. It was polychrome, so there's some left you can see. So this very lifelike, moving figure, just kind of art history 101. This is a sculpture, this is a human. You just see it. It's so moving. I had this idea that people would kind of use her, visit her every day in the community, and they would go and talk to her. I imagine young women in particular, and they would have this kind of notion of communion with her, so that it would be part of people's everyday as they were just passing by the outside of the church, which also accounts for the damage. But I haven't found anything else like it.
It's also extraordinary when we look at windows, as you pointed out, the sort of site of sexual access, but then we have this, the marker of no access, no access to the outside for this person. Like bars is not something that we've really discussed over the past day and a half, but it is a feature of the window. Yeah.
But of course, I mean, in lots of the literature too, it was quite Freudian. I mean, even when you go back to the interpretations of those very, very early examples of apertures in buildings as associated with the female body. Female genitalia is quite extraordinary. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you. I was also wondering about age. So is it mostly young women, or I think there was one image with an older
I
woman
had
at
to work
the,
very hard to find
yeah.
a non-young, beautiful woman. And I had to ship one over from New York. It was very expensive, but I thought, my goodness, but it was very telling. It's a beautiful young woman at the window, almost always. And when it's not, when I showed the woman, the slightly older woman, the entire composition is about her age. So I don't know if you saw the candle burning down, the empty vessel, the bird cage is open, the bird has flown. And what it's hard to see, but in the background, there's a young couple cuddling sexually in the background. And so it's her absent love and their young love being contrasted as well as the candle burns down. So it's quite heavy-handed.
But that also seems like when we were talking about the shop front earlier and how what's shown in the shop front is the desirable, woman or young, attractive, what we consider conventionally attractive. Any other questions? Because I have another question, but I can speak to her during the drinks if someone else wants to jump in.
Sorry, it's just really quickly, and I'm being greedy having two questions. Could you just talk a bit about the image on the right?
Yes, I'd be happy to.
Because it's fascinating, and I'd like to know if it's completely unique or are there other examples like it and what's going on.
I'd be delighted to talk about that picture. I couldn't believe it. First of all, when I went to Polston Lacey and I saw it, I thought, I haven't found anything like this practically in the history of art. Usually when you see a Black woman or a Black man, they're sort of like subsidiary figures in Renaissance and Baroque art, usually at the adoration of the Magi or a page or something like that. And so I definitely wanted her because she is in this beautiful dress with this amazing headdress and the pearl earring. So clearly being represented as a woman of some stature. There's been tons of debate about this picture. I slightly flipped it on its head because people say, oh, was this an enslaved woman who was in the work, in the household of the artist? And actually I did a little bit more research, and as we know, many people are into the Netherlands in this period, and there was a sort of second and third generation of formerly enslaved peoples who were becoming quite prosperous. And I do wonder if she's actually one of those women. What's interesting for or against that argument is that the artist portrays his wife in a very similar dress. So she's either of the same stature or she's lent her dress. But either way, I thought it was a really exciting image to get people talking and rethinking what they thought they were seeing. Thank you for asking.
I think it's really interesting what you're saying about your curation and your very careful selection of these, but also as you talked about that there being a lack of information, a lack of names from a certain point, and that changing at a certain moment, and how you curatorially sort of talked to the viewers, to the audience about that, about the frustrations, and particularly as a female curator, about how there wasn't this information before a certain point, or how you describe that in the catalogue.
Was there a question, or you just
how you did that, how
Yes.
you explained
how
that?
I did.
We can hear it here, but how you
Yes.
explained that within the exhibition.
Yes. Well, I went on at length in the exhibition, but I especially used the section on models and muses. So the room title, or sort of the room introduction, to talk about that, and then each label addressed that issue. So I was saying, you may not have noticed so far, but every woman I've shown you is a girl, a man, a young boy, a girl, an older woman, a this, a that, a type. And actually, in many cases, for the Rembrandt girl, we actually know who it was now. There were sketches and he portrayed her several times. There's the painting in Stockholm. So she isn't a type. So why do we keep perpetuating her as a type and that sort of thing? So I use that again, going back to Rembrandt and saying, let's give these women names we now know. And I really deliberately included the Picasso, Françoise Gillot, not least because, of course, Françoise has written her own biography talking about what it was like to live with Picasso. And it's sort of one of those moments like say her name, because he essentially ruined her career and ensured that no art dealers would work with her once she left him. This upset one of the reviewers of the exhibition that I said that Picasso was abusive.
Was the reviewer male or female?
I think you know the answer.
Hello. On the subject of François Gillot, I was hoping that somebody would talk about people gazing out of the window and longing to be somewhere else or
Yeah.
yearning. And you talking about that one gave me the confidence to ask you the question. How come that's not a theme?
Oh, it is actually. If you have a look at the book, there's one of the themes was the woman in the domestic interior. And that entire section was on that theme, which we tend to get more in the kind of 18th and 19th century of the woman enclosed in the domestic interior, always peeling potatoes or staring longingly out of the window, sort of perhaps, yes, completely in command of her own domain, but often looking longingly out the window. Sometimes you get young girls looking longingly out the window, and there's a nice interpretation of that, of sort of looking forward to the unknown and wondering, what her life will be, but quite melancholic in the case of the woman in the domestic interior. So that was kind of, it was a large section. I just didn't have time to go into it. So, but thank you for noting it. I agree. It was a great question.
And then we'll just do one more question.
I was going to ask this before that question came, actually, but do we ever see the woman outside the window?
Let me think if I included. I included women with their backs to the window. So the window was the feature of the composition, and I thought it was very interesting that they were kind of immersed in their domestic interior and not paying attention to the space outside. Depending on how you interpret the Louise Bourgeois or the Isa Genskin, the woman is outside the window, or indeed the Jolly screen. And I liked the idea of playing on gender because, I think a man can feel like what it feels like to be the woman at the window as well. And so in this case, you are the woman outside the window. It's inside outside. It goes back to our point. And certainly in the case of the Louise Bourgeois, the woman is outside the window, but she's also in the window with those kind of female body landscape shapes that Bourgeois liked so much.
So I'm just going to do a really brief wrap up, but I was struck when you said that, this trans-historical kind of show is becoming more prevalent, because I've been struck by this conference that because it's not on one area, one time, that it's so rich and that it's so exciting because it's so outside of everything I know and all these other things. But it's also, it must be because if you're just doing a Renaissance exhibition, you know who the experts are on that field. And so you go to those few voices. But for something like this, you get to have, you're at a dinner and you say, okay, can you think of any window, that it becomes this conversation and it opens up so many avenues you probably hadn't considered when you first went into this. So that's just kind of my segue into thanking all of you for joining us for one or both days of the Window Symposium. And I think we can all agree there's been so much food for thought from scholars at various stages of their careers, based in different parts of the world, and coming at the material from a host of angles. And as I've mentioned previously, yesterday's proceedings and today's proceedings have been recorded and will be edited by the fabulous Femi, and they will eventually go up on Paul Mellon Center's website. And if you subscribe to the Paul Mellon Center's newsletter, I imagine that they might point out when it's gone up online, but it's also, other events that are going on, a few more before the end of the year, and then the program for 2025, as well as opportunities for funding or for other things, because the Paul Mellon Center is really wonderful and supports in so many ways, so many different kinds of scholars and people approaching this material. Just as a reminder, the current drawing room display that is also about windows is up through the end of February and includes a range of objects from across the archives and library collections that all engage with the theme of windows. It's free to visit the exhibition, but do check the PMC's website for updated opening hours, as the building will be closed for a period over the holidays. And just as a little teaser, the exhibition, it's very, very small. It's one little room, but it's actually divided thematically broadly into 3 areas. The window as visual culture, the window in visual culture, and the window as facilitator of visual culture. So different objects related to those themes. And then just before we wrap up, and I know we want to go get a quick drink, I wanted to say a few quick thank yous. Firstly, a big thanks to John Millington and everyone here at the Warburg for allowing us to be here. They've been so generous, and it is such a great space, even if we are freezing our little bums off. But it is brand new. It's brand new, and they let us come look at it when it hadn't even been completed, and they've just been so supportive, and it has windows, and we love windows, so that's really good. And then I really wanted to I owe immense thanks to everyone at the PMC, because it really is a group effort to put together a symposium and display, and I'm so thankful that I was given this opportunity. And I just want to highlight a few specific names. I feel like I'm at the Academy Awards and the music is going to start and kick me off the stage. But obviously for the symposium, I would like to highlight Ella and Kathleen and Femi, who are all here with us in the room. And then for the display, I'm hopefully not going to miss any names. You will notice that there are a lot of them, but Martin, who chaired earlier today, as well as Charlotte, Emma, Gaetano, Fiona, Hannah, and Phoebe in archives and library, and with additional help from Daisy. So it has been such a joy to work with you all over the past few months, and I'm really, really pleased with how everything went today. So I hope you will all join me and the symposium speakers for a drink and to continue our discussions on windows in British architecture and visual culture.